welcome to Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm a professor of media studies here at Purdue Calumet. And my co-host, co-host is Dr. Tom Roach, who's a professor of public relations here at Purdue Calumet. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
We are going to discuss a topical issue that came up in the news about a week ago that concerns people in communication and I think the general public, which is the question of integrity and accuracy in the news that we receive. Last week, I don't know exactly what day it was, Tom, but Brian Williams, the anchor of NBC Nightly News, highly respected, highly paid news anchor, admitted that he misrepresented his experience in Iraq. He claimed he was in a helicopter that was shot down and kind of embellishes the whole story. He essentially lied. His helicopter was not hit. His helicopter wasn't even forced down. His helicopter, turns out, wasn't even following the helicopter that was hit. He landed an hour later. The helicopters were heading in opposite directions. So that's the conditions. I guess we could argue facts, but I don't know if we should. What's your take on a leading newscaster being discovered as somebody fabricating news as something as important as a war in Iraq?
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, the facts aren't really that much in dispute here. So, the question is, what does this mean, right? I think that a lot of people are looking at it and they're saying, well, we all maybe get caught up and exaggerate things from time to time. We remember things differently than the way they were. And I'm sure that's true. But if you get paid the big bucks to represent NBC, and if you're a journalist, right, you're not supposed to be the sort of person who misremembers the facts and, and can't tell if you were in a helicopter that got shot down or not. I think that we need to remind ourselves that this isn't the guy next door who got caught up in this. This was the news anchor at NBC. I think they have the highest ratings of all of the news shows, right?
And he has been well respected.
This
somebody you could count on to get the truth from.
Right. So it is, I think, an unforgivable offense in this case. I think that when you look at apologia, which is what we call it if you're in a situation where you've said something that you need to deliver an explanation or an apology for, right? Usually, apologizing, acknowledging that you did something wrong gets you over it and people forgive you and you move on. But I think we really have to take into account his professional stature here, and I think that makes this an unforgivable offense. And I also think that that regardless of who he is, given how memorable getting shot down is, right? I don't think that anybody could imagine that they got shot down if they didn't get shot down. So I think, he shouldn't be making these mistakes at all. And I think that the kind of mistake he claims he made isn't really a mistake. I think it was a
This is my question. Is this a mistake?
It's not.
It's not a mistake.
How could it be?
Then if it's not a mistake, and using civil terms, he has tried to embellish his position. For what purpose? I mean, we can look at this from the point of view of Brian Williams.
Right.
And people have done this about his personality. Or you can look at it at another level. What purpose does it serve NBC to having a journalist that's embellishing stories?
Well, I also think there are journalists and then there are journalists. And, the people writing for the prestige dailies like the New York Times or the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, they usually have a different background than the people who are selected to be on television and broadcast the news. And I think they have higher standards. I think that's apparent. But So
okay.
is this, I mean, are we really talking about journalists here anyway when we're talking about people who are sitting in front of
So you're
talking heads?
suggesting the anchor isn't really a journalist,
Well,
somebody else a journalist.
yeah.
Just as an aside, I would,
Yeah.
and we don't.
Isn't that apparent looking at what we're looking at here, right?
Yes, but I would dispute whether or not journalists, that there's some difference, that somehow the people that work for the New York Times are going to be more accurate and do more fact checking. I mean, we know that Judith Miller's entire story about the Iraq War was based on false information, which she knew to be false.
Right.
I just finished a study recently on the coverage of Judy Ruderin, who's the eyewitness reporter of the New York Times in Jerusalem for the war in Gaza.
Right.
And she even admitted on her blog that she doesn't go to Gaza. But she's giving eyewitness reports about tunnels and attacks and the rest. So I would just, I guess I would question whether or not Brian Williams is just a pretty face with a big pompadour, and there's the hardworking journalists out there telling us the truth.
Yeah. And this may sound like I'm splitting hairs, but I think, in some cases, maybe a journalist might use bad judgment and write a compilation story that sounds like an eyewitness account of something, right? Which isn't to say that they should do that, but I can see how that happens. That seems to me to be less of an infraction here than making up a story about being in combat when you weren't there. And I think the difference here is that all television shows just shamelessly self-promote themselves. It doesn't matter if they're news or they're sitcoms or whatever they are. And I think that probably they needed to draw a line there years ago, and they never drew it. And so they pack him up and they put him on a helicopter, and they ask the Army to fly him around a little bit so he can claim that he was in the war. And they take good care of him, and they keep him out of harm's way so that they can promote the show. And then he comes back, and and maybe he didn't start, maybe somebody else suggested that he was in the helicopter. I don't know how this started, I mean, you can almost feel sorry for him because it's such a mechanism there to promote that show, right? And he gets caught up in it, and the next thing you know, he's telling everybody, yeah, I was there, and we hit the ground really hard, and never forget that.
It's not something, again, if we just focus on Brian Williams, and we kind of have to because this is the topic right now, but this isn't the first time, nor was it the last time that he misrepresented or misremembered. Right. He claimed to be the first person to talk to Nelson Mandela after Mandela won the historic election in South Africa.
Right.
He claimed he was the one that goes into his room and was the first one to shake his hand, even though Mandela gave a big speech the night before. In Williams' mind, he was the first one.
Right.
He
He's
claimed,
a little Forrest Gumpish, right? Yeah.
Well, where was I? I mean, he got his recognition from NBC and got the anchor primarily because of his role in covering Katrina. Right. And he claimed to have witnessed a suicide in the Superdome, which led to a whole number of things that were basically racist in character about the marauding black masses in New Orleans. And he started it by claiming to see a suicide, which never happened. He says he looked out his French Quarter hotel window and saw bodies floating in the water, and there was no water in the street.
Well, I mean,
he claimed I mean, I'm not going to go down and down, but it's not like this.
You've got a good list.
I've got a list.
I'll grant you that. Yeah.
But so I agree with you. It's not a mistake. It's an attempt to embellish. It's an attempt to maybe make himself more important. But another question
But just a quick item on that. Right? I just want to point out, somebody does one of those things at the Washington Post or the New York Times, and they're fired, right?
I don't know. Judith Miller got an award.
Television News Network keeps the guy on and lets him keep, perpetuating the problem because their ratings are good.
I think the question is what inaccuracy you have claimed.
Yes.
Not so much the medium, because again, I have personal experience being in Nicaragua when the New York Times reporter's at the same breakfast that I'm at that table, and the next morning he claims to have witnessed a demonstration in front of the Ministry of Labor, and I know for a fact he wasn't there.
Right.
And again, there's plenty of evidence to show that the New York Times, I would say, does not rise above the level of the Brian Williams. I think the exception is that he got found out. And the interesting thing to me is who found him out and why did they find him out on this? This wasn't the result of an NBC fact checker. How did he get found out?
Well, it was, I think it was people who were responding to a story that was posted, right?
Yeah, but
It was
from
the
2003,
guys
suddenly.
who are on the helicopter were saying the story's false, right?
Yeah. And they were soldiers. And in the
Yeah.
climate of
Yeah.
defending American soldiers, the idea that he would lie and kind of be disrespectful to soldiers, which
Yeah.
he claimed that was his intent all along. And that to me is the problem, when the news reporters
Yeah.
are less concerned about the accuracy and more concerned and lie in the intent.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's useful to think of this as something that's indicative of all reporters here. I think that...
I wouldn't say reporters, I would say the news
Yeah.
institutions,
Right.
which is different than the reporters.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that there's a level of professionalism in the news industry that doesn't allow this, okay, and that most of the people who represent the news industry, at least the print journalists, right, make more of an effort to live up to those standards than some of the television journalists. Now, I'm not can't defend all of them.
No,
right?
and I'm not prepared to have that conversation.
And I don't know how much time we got left before the break here, but...
how much time do we have left before the break?
Okay.
Couple minutes.
All right. So one of the things I wanted to point out, though, about the supposed apology that he gave, right, is and you mentioned this. He said that he misremembered it, I think, something like that, right, and that he really was only told this story because he wanted to honor the servicemen and women who had fought in the war. So he essentially delivered an apology that was another lie.
Yes, and he got caught in that too.
Yeah, yes. And he got caught in that too, because common sense tells you don't claim that you were in a battle environment, right, and getting shot at and almost shot out of the sky to honor the people who really did that, right? It really dishonors them, right? And you don't misremember things if you're one of the highest paid journalists in the world, right? So he made the situation worse. So it seems to me that the real issue now isn't so much what he said as it is what he says about him, right?
Okay.
So if he made this up in the first place, and if he then gave a false
testimony,
apologia, right,
Yeah.
about himself, then essentially we have evidence here that this guy just lies. He's just a dishonest person.
Okay,
right?
I'm willing to go there, and we're going to take a break, I think,
okay.
in a few minutes. But here's what I want you to think about and what I'd like to talk about.
Yeah.
To what extent do we want to impugn the person and replace him with another person, like Geraldo Rivera, or another person like Bill O'Reilly, or another person, and I would say print names like Jody Ruderin, right? I understand he can't apologize and then tell another lie. The question is, where were the fact checkers at NBC? Where are the fact checkers at the New York Times? Where is the institutional responsibility for people that are telling falsehoods? You have to think about it because we have to take a break.
Okay.
We'll be back in
Thank
just a couple seconds. Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. This is a student-produced, student-run interviewing program. Today I am your co-host. My name is Lee Artz. I'm a professor of media studies. And my partner here is Tom Roach, who's a professor of public relations. And we're sharing the questions and answers, but I'm doing most of the grilling here. So right before we left, I was asking you to think about what does this tell us about the relationship between working journalists and the institutions that they work for. You're trying to make a distinction between news media that's televised and news media that's print, and I'm having none of that, by the way.
Right.
But even if we accept that, the question remains, how does an individual journalist maintain their integrity if they're expected to go to a region and come back with a particular objective news report? I'd be interested in
Well, maybe if I could just raise a broader issue for a second, and we could come back to that. I think that part of what complicates all of this is that news institutions in the 1950s and 60s were making claims about being objective. And which was always kind of ironic, because if you were in journalism school like I was, they admitted there's no such thing as objectivity. All human expression is subjective. And then you'd get into the news writing class and they'd tell you, and by the way, your story better be objective. Right? So we deal with this sort of illusion that we can produce objective accounts of events. And they promote themselves on that, right? And so now we have all these people saying, well, wait a second, this isn't objective and that's wrong and that guy lied, how come they're not policing that? And the reality is, reporters, they're like people in any other profession. There's good doctors and not so good doctors, and there's professors who do their homework and have great lectures, and there's professors who are going in and winging it and maybe giving out false information, right? But the university isn't fact-checking to make sure that everything some professor says in the classroom is correct, and I don't think it's reasonable to expect a news network to fact-check that one of their reporters said at a rally for or at a hockey game, right? That he was on a helicopter that landed when it was under fire. It's just, they're people, and they can't possibly live up to the expectations that they set for themselves in the mid-20th century.
You're doing a better apology for Brian Williams and Brian. I'm human. I make mistakes.
I feel like I was I think I was on that helicopter.
Do you really want to go in and have a doctor and say, oh, he's human, he might make a mistake?
They do, though, don't they?
Of course they do, but you don't accept that. You don't. Being a doctor or being a journalist should have a standard that's different than the guy that's mowing my grass or pumping the gas. I mean, this is something where you are not only claiming, but presumably you have the credibility based on your experience. I mean, it's one thing to say, I was on a helicopter and I think over there I saw some people and I was mistaken. It's another thing to claim you were on a helicopter that you weren't even on. That's a big distance from being human and making a mistake.
I'm defending the news industry. I'm not defending Brian Williams, okay? Brian Williams, is a blight on the system right now, okay?
Do you know PolitiFact? You can Google PolitiFact. The latest scoreboard showed more than 60% of the claims on Fox News were mostly false or worse.
Right. Now,
they
that's
found that
60% of the news, 60% of the claims, which is
60% of the claims by pundits, hosts, paid contributors. Yes. Yeah. And they also found on MSNBC,
which doesn't surprise anybody, I'm sure.
And NBC. Well, here's one: MSNBC and NBC. 44% of their claims were mostly false or worse. So almost half of what you get
what
off
do we mean
NBC.
By claim? What do we mean by mostly false? I mean, I thought things are either true or they're false, right? How can they be mostly false?
I accept that Brian Williams was in Iraq. That part's true. And I accept he was on a helicopter.
Yes,
so his story is partially true.
Yes.
I accept that there was a helicopter that got shot at. That's partially true. Right?
Well, that's how you would define those things. That's
what makes those partly true but mostly false. That's the definition. And
look, I am equally disappointed with the quality of news coverage.
Okay.
I really am.
Good.
But I just think that we need to be realistic about it. I mean, give me another profession that tries to be as ethical as journalism does. I mean, do you think university professors are more ethical than journalists? Do you think doctors are more ethical than journalists?
Dad, I was smoking in the shed, but so is the neighbor. Yes, I had an accident, but don't blame me. There's 50,000 every year.
So then you're expecting...
What you're saying is, I'm innocent because other people are guilty.
But
That's
then you're
not a very good...
You're expecting perfection then, right? Either it's going to be all right all of the time, or we lump them all together. There's no black or white. It's just everything's gray, right?
No, I would think that if you were on a helicopter, you would know that you were on the helicopter.
I'm not defending this guy.
I would think if you're in the New York Times and you want some...
I think they should have thrown him off of that helicopter, probably.
I think if you're the New York Times and covering Israel's invasion of Gaza, you should actually have people in Gaza, that you shouldn't simply go to the Israeli Defense Force.
So are you making the point that Brian Williams violated a trust, or are you making the point that all journalists are violating the trust? Where are you going with this?
I'm thinking that there are journalists with integrity that would like to do their jobs.
Yeah.
But it is extremely difficult in a climate, as you described at the
Yeah.
outset, that all of these media institutions have become corporations that are puffing themselves up to get more viewers to be able to make the advertising dollars.
Well, so-
in that climate,
Yeah.
it's hard for a good journalist
Right.
with integrity to
But
succeed.
that climate is called the 21st century, right? I mean, this is,
So we have.
this is where we ended up, right? So,
Yeah,
so the question is, what do we want to have instead here? What are we going to do instead? If I'm supposed to be a citizen and I've got to know what happened in Iraq, should I go by what I'm hearing from my neighbors? How am I supposed to find out?
Well,
I can't trust the broadcasters. I can't trust what I'm reading in the newspaper. So where do I go? How do I find out? How do I know who to vote for president?
well, that's a whole different story because I don't think you
But
should
where do I
vote for
go?
either one. But
Where do I go?
I think you go to people that are there. I mean,
So 300 million people are going to go around looking for somebody who was there when this helicopter crash
oh no,
landed, so we
no,
can find out what happened.
but they're in the war, not when that helicopter crashed. Precisely. If you watch the news, the University of Massachusetts did a study
Yeah.
that showed the more people watched about the war, the less they knew. So the more hours you watched, the less you knew.
Yeah,
So you
I
can't-
find that hard to believe.
Oh, okay.
I mean, if we can question the news source, can't we question the research from the university?
Absolutely, but I'd probably have more confidence in a University of Massachusetts Department of Communication,
Oh, no.
our colleagues
Would you
doing the
really?
study, than I would
Who do you think's
Brian
more ethical,
Williams.
university professors or journalists? Lump them together. What do you think?
I'm not going to lump journalists together
Oh
at
yeah,
all.
come on.
No,
What do you
no,
think?
I don't think all journalists can be impugned
Yeah.
either as ethical or unethical.
Yeah.
But I think the journalists that get the assignments for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or the journalists that get the assignments for NBC and CBS, have already an ideological perspective that's going to be met by what they see.
Can't deny that.
And they're,
right?
and they're
I mean, I can't
only
deny
going to
that.
report certain news, and it may not even be
But
inaccurate.
Lee, I mean,
but
you're
it's
still arguing
insufficient.
against the claim in the 50s that they were objective. They're not objective. If everything everyone utters, because it's a human expression, is subjective, right? Then that's not on the table. We understand they're not objective. They're Americans. They grew up in this country. They think we're better than everyone else, right? They've been reading the news for 6 months, and they think that that the Russians are the bad guys in the Ukraine, right? And so they're going into all these things with all of these prejudicial ideas that they have, right? Like everybody else does with
no,
everything.
it can't be like
but the
everybody-
point
it
that I'm
can't
making
be
here
like
is
everybody
that
else
journalists are trying, as a profession, they're trying to keep that in check as much as they can, for the most part, and trying to get objective as they can in the objective accounts of what's going on. And now, if you don't think any of them are trying that, I want you to tell me that, okay? Then I'll defend them against that, because I think most of them are trying to do that. If you think that they're not making a good enough effort at it, then I want to compare them to professors and to lawyers and to bankers, right? And I want you to tell me that you think they're not doing as good a job as these other professions
No,
are.
again, I'm
But
not going to go down the path of, because other people are doing it, it's okay, I'm doing it.
That's not my
That's
argument.
Your pet.
No, it's
They're
not my
not any
argument.
more ethical than lawyers or professors. That's irrelevant. The point is, you are claiming to be a journalist that is reporting the facts. And if your defense is, I can't report anything more than what I already believe I will see, that's not a very good defense either. Because I think it is possible. You can't say, well, I'm going to go cover the Ukraine, but because I think Russia's to blame for everything since 1917, what do you expect me to see? That's a specious, unacceptable argument.
But let me see if I understand this. So you're saying that the people that are covering these things are conscious of the fact that they're misrepresenting what's happening and are doing it anyway. Is that your point? That
No,
they know that they're cheating. They know that they're.
I seriously doubt that they have any question at all about their own integrity.
Who's at fault then? Who's at fault?
I think the institution is. The
so-
New York Times, the Washington Post, the ABC News. Yes,
Okay.
they're major corporations,
Isn't it possible-
and their primary purpose is to make a profit, not to sell us the news.
So somebody with a finance degree sits down and looks at all of the news and says, okay, we need to cover this way because it's going to make this group happy, and we need to cover this way because this group's going to be happy. And if we do all of that, we're going to make more money this year. I mean, that's a logical,
You're not
planned out.
You're not far off. Yes, you're not far off. Yes. Not only do they do that, they even decide what we will cover. this is not newsworthy because our target audience doesn't care about it. In Northwest Indiana.
Oh, that's a different issue. That's a different issue. No, it's a different issue.
Northwest Indiana.
That's a
the
different
majority
issue.
of people that read the paper work for a living. But there is no labor section of the newspaper.
I defend them.
There's a business section of the newspaper.
I defend them. I'll happily defend them if you're saying there's something wrong with them covering stories that are going to be most interesting to their target audience. So they have to do that. It's a business. They have to sell newspapers. People have to watch their show so their ratings go up so they can sell ads. Now, I'm not
I
saying,
agree with that.
I'm not saying they're consciously covering the story in a certain way. I'm
Precisely.
saying that they're deciding what to cover based on that, not how to cover it. That's my point.
They do both. They do both. And if you're saying you should only cover it because it only affects your target audience, you're basically saying that the media is no longer the fifth estate, does not serve the public interest.
I'm acknowledging all that.
Okay,
I think that
then
they overstated their position.
We should have started this whole conversation with the premise that the news media does not serve the public interest. And we're going to return to this because we don't have a long time. We've got about 30 seconds.
Okay.
I would encourage people to look at PolitiFact. I would encourage people to check the facts of your own newspaper and your own television reporting.
Fine. And my wrap-up, my wrap-up, that's
You can
good.
do the closing.
My wrap-up is that the real crime here with Brian Williams is that what he did solidifies opinions that people already have that you can't trust what you're getting from the news, right? And I think that
But we shouldn't
that
if it's not in the public interest
he compromised the whole profession when he did this.
He got found out.
He
got found out. There's a difference.
Yeah, he gave amplification to the kinds of arguments that my colleague here is making, right? And I think people as citizens
3, 2, 1.
need to ask themselves, where am I going to get information if I don't trust journalists?
Great. That's all the time we have on our program. Thank you for joining me on the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lee Artz, with my guest, Tom Roach. Have a great day.